as mentioned earlier, I'm the new guy, I guess, right? Having just arrived in January. So let me just give you a quick review of my background. I'll talk about some of the work that I do and where it fits into the informatics landscape that we've heard about today. So I'm a computer scientist by training. I got my PhD actually from Carolina a number of years ago, and then worked in industry for about a decade at IBM Research. And my initial research focus was really not so much health related, but more information related. How do we build systems and technologies that combine humans together with the computational power that we have with analytics and those kinds of things to make data more insightful. And I think this gets to what you commented on before about people working in these gray areas. Computers know about black and white, zeros and ones. So you can write algorithms that just process data and find the highest correlation. But that might not be semantically meaningful. Right? Meanwhile, you have people who are trained and experts in their field that understand what is important and what is not, at least to some degree. They have some knowledge of context and the semantics of what's happening. But they also can't look through 100 million patient records and try and find the people who are most similar to the person you're trying to treat. So they go on the three people they treated in the last week and what worked for them. So what I'm interested in my research is trying to figure out how we can combine data analytics with interactive visualization and interactive interfaces that can process those kinds of large volumes of data to derive insights that then people working with those analytics can bring to bear on whatever decision they're trying to make. And I, again, started working on that independent from healthcare, then shifted over the years to the health informatics space because it's such an interesting problem space. The data is so complicated, the tasks that people are doing are so hard, and it's important. So I worked on that for a long time, focusing on clinical and population informatics, using kind of the terms that we're talking about here. So looking at individual patients and then also broader populations, trying to understand how we can take advantage of all this electronic data that we're collecting now. And in particular, the interest that I have is trying to take advantage of this structured patient data that we're capturing. So for a long time, we've been collecting curated data, PubMed, all these things. And they're highly valuable, and those will continue to be valuable for the future. But at the same time, there's this new data source that's emerging, and we talked about it, Ashraf mentioned, with the clinical warehouse, right, where we can now query for all the patients who had diabetes, right, with all kinds of other constraints. And we can do that at very large scales. So on campus here, they have ISIS, if people know about that, at Lineberger, which is the Integrated Cancer Information Surveillance System, which has data for 6 million patients across the state, both cancer patients and well patients, to try and do surveillance and all sorts of population health studies. And once you have 6 million patient records that you can process and analyze, the question becomes, what can you do with all of that data? Beyond what that data was initially collected for, which is to treat an individual patient, to replace that paper folder. And so one of the things that I've explored is looking at ways to use that data to provide personalized insights to help inform decisions about individual patients. And the idea is to supplement the curated data, where people go out and do a randomized controlled trial. They have a bunch of exclusion criteria to separate the people who don't have comorbidities, who don't have other kinds of medications. And then you have this very clean group. You can do an analysis, you can publish it in the literature, it gets peer reviewed, and now you're changing medicine. But the problem is that when a patient then comes through the door, your patient doesn't fit those exclusion criteria. Instead, your patient does have those 4 other comorbidities. They are on a bunch of other medications. They do have all sorts of other problems. And there's no paper out there, or there's no published literature that says what to do for people just like this person. So what we're trying to do are look at ways we can look at those 6 million patient records that I talked about before, or even larger systems. There's one called PQRNet, which is a patient-centered outcomes research where there's a collaborative across the country where they're pulling data together. To try and understand, for an individual patient, can we look and find the people out of those millions of records who are clinically most similar to the patient that you're looking at, analyze that data, find again, who is most similar, then further process them to try and help you make a decision about which treatment might be most effective for people like this in the same situation. And then you can look at the data that's derived out of that source in the same way that you would look at data that comes out of your literature search. And then you, as the domain expert, can look at both of those in context and try and use that to make a more informed choice. So that's on kind of the personalized clinical informatics side, looking at predictive analytics, patient similarity, and then of course how you present that data to the user. So a lot of work on visualization, how you present this complex, uncertain data to people to try and make an informed decision and understand the statistics and all the assumptions that go into this information, even though the person looking at it is not necessarily trained as a statistician, like a clinician. So how do you present that information so that they can value that information in the right way, not assume that it's more certain than it really is, those sorts of things. And then at the other side, if we have all of this data, rather than just looking at, in the context of one patient, who is most similar and trying to inform a decision out of that, we can also look at whole segments of the population and try and learn something about a group of patients from this type of secondary use observational data that wasn't collected for the particular study that you're trying to do. So that brings a whole bunch of challenges. Right? You have bias in the data. You might be merging data from multiple different sources who code data different ways because it wasn't coded for the specific study. So how can you deal with missingness and differences in coding, ambiguity? How can you adjust for all of that? If you just apply these algorithms that are ones and zeros to people who have a disease coded in a slightly different way in the ICD-9 coding scheme, all of a sudden those patients have different diseases. And the algorithm doesn't know that semantically they're actually the same. So can we build visualization tools that combine with the underlying statistics to help surface things that might be similar and provide visualization tools to help people connect and merge data and align it and transform it so that you can take this messy population health data, turn it into something that you can then do systematic studies on top of. And so, as an example, that's some of the work that I'm now starting to try and kick off with people here at UNC since I've arrived, in particular in the epidemiology and biostats over at Billings. We're working with Lineberger on their ISIS system to try and take this 6 million patient collection they have from 20 different sources, all coded in different ways, where now when they have a research study, they go to someone like Gotz. And this isn't the 8-hour thing, this is the 4-week thing that has to be funded from a grant. And you have a bunch of computer people spending 4 weeks putting together data transformation query algorithms, and they return it back to the epidemiologist who asked the question, and they have 3 patients or 2 patients that match their criteria, because once it goes through this big mash of transformation, everyone's excluded. And so now they have to reformulate their question, and they spend another couple weeks going through the data again. So can we speed that up and actually let the epidemiologist explore the data and try and derive those insights? So those are the kinds of applications that we're working on. The kind of research questions, in addition to the actual application areas, like trying to predict heart failure based on similar patients, or to predict treatment change when people will have to change medications, or understanding population. So those are the application questions. Then the underlying research questions that we're exploring are things like, how do we design and architect systems to deal with millions of patient records with tens of thousands of different variables for each patient that's sparse and incomplete? How do we formulate those statistical questions and analyses to be robust to those kinds of things? How do we formulate them to surface the most important variables out of those 10,000 things? And what algorithms do we need to process that data? So it's the technology side. And the other side, which is, I think, as interesting, perhaps more, is once we have all those algorithms, and we calculated this data point that says this person is more at risk of heart failure, how do we then present that to the user? So how do we understand how to convey information to the user, let them explore through a complicated information space that goes into this one number, in such a way that they can trust it and understand its implications in terms of the decision they're making, whether it's in clinical practice or in understanding population health, setting policies for people. So those are kind of the two sides of the question. So underlying technology, and then how that interacts with people, and how people will be able to use these technologies and understand the information and try to open up that black box in a way that's meaningful. So, anyway, that's a quick overview of the kind of work that I do.
Thank you.
Thanks.